I cleaned up your room, Lyra. It was a mess. Emerging from my room with a smug grin on her face was Sherry, my son's wife. Oh. Thank you. I had just cleaned my room a few days ago. But maybe it still looked messy to someone else. I decided to just thank her for now. Sherry, my son's wife, never lifts a finger around the house. She's always snarky and throws tantrums when things don't go her way. So, her cleaning my room? That's suspicious, to say the least. I don't know what you're up to, but it won't work. I muttered quietly, making sure Sherry, who was watching TV at high volume, couldn't hear me. Then I went back to my chores. I've put up with a lot from her, and my patience is wearing thin. I've warned her before, but if she continues to act this way, she'll have to face the consequences. My name is Lyra. And I'm 73 years old. I met my husband Frank at a social event. We were both shy at first, but now we enjoy our evening coffee chats. After we got married, I became pregnant with our son George. Frank was thrilled and helped me with chores, even though he was clumsy. Once George moved out for work, our lively home became quiet, and we felt a bit lonely. Then George brought home Sherry, his then girlfriend. Frank and I thought she was beautiful and well-mannered. Sherry looked dazzling as she sat on the sofa with her long black hair tied up and her back straight. My husband and I talked a lot with Sherry, leaving George alone because he was too nervous to understand what he was saying. We liked her so much that we encouraged George to marry her quickly, which they did. Life got busy again with their honeymoon and moving to a new place, but we enjoyed it. We were disappointed when they decided not to have children, but we understood. We thought peaceful days were ahead, but we were wrong. They kept coming back home for trivial reasons. Whether it was a broken air conditioner in the summer or unpaid electric bills in the winter, they'd stay with us but leave all the work to us. At first, we felt sorry for them, but it became increasingly annoying. Frank, who once welcomed them warmly, now gets stressed just seeing them. As for George, he's as oblivious as ever, acting like he can do whatever he wants. My son and daughter-in-law decided to come visit us out of the blue. George called me last week and said, "Hey, Mom? We're coming over next week. Just a heads up." Then he went radio silent, leaving me in the dark about when exactly they'd arrive. Then, just as suddenly, I got a message from Sherry saying, "We'll be there soon, so get ready." I had to scramble to prepare everything. Frank said, "You handle the bedding and clothes. I'll go buy the groceries we're missing. If you could jot down a shopping list, that'd be great." Then he went to change. I thanked him and quickly wrote down the ingredients for tonight's dinner, placing the note on the living room table. Then I started airing out the guest futon. When I returned to the living room, Frank was looking at the note. "Is this everything? If you remember anything else, just text me and I'll pick it up." He left with a smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. Just as I was about to get the clothes, I heard a loud voice from the entrance.
"Lyra? Are you there?"
Sherry was calling me from the front door without even ringing the doorbell. I rushed to open it.
"Come on, you knew we were coming. Why didn't you leave the door open?"
Sherry complained as she walked in. When she heard that, she instantly wrinkled her eyebrows and complained. "What's the matter?" "It's rude not to be happy when someone comes to visit," he retorted. I held my tongue and welcomed her in. "Where's George?" I asked, noticing his absence.
"Oh, Frank snagged him for grocery shopping."
I was a bit annoyed by her nonchalant attitude, but decided to let it go and continued with my preparations. Sherry didn't lift a finger to help. She just sat there, eating her own snacks and occasionally laughing at the TV. After a while, she suddenly stood up and left the living room. I assumed she went to the bathroom and didn't think much of it. But when she returned, she looked pleased.
Lyra, your room was a mess, so I cleaned it up for you.
I was taken aback. She had gone into my room without asking. I had questions, but decided to thank her anyway. She grinned and plopped back down on the sofa. Just then, Frank and George returned. I had asked Frank to buy quite a lot, knowing that the young couple would be staying for a few days. Frank had apparently enlisted George as his pack mule. And it looked like he had accomplished his mission. Frank handed me the groceries, stepping over a visibly exhausted George who was still holding bags at the entrance. After saying thanks, I took out what I needed and started putting the rest away in the fridge.
Hey, George. Stop lounging and bring everything here.
Frank, who had just scolded George still sitting by the entrance, pours himself some iced coffee and heads to the living room. George, looking a bit annoyed, eventually brings in all the bags in a few trips. Man, I'm beat. Mom, pour me some iced coffee too.
Do it yourself.
Frank scolds George again for his whiny tone, but I prepare the coffee with a wry smile. Welcome back, thank you. Dinner will be ready soon, so just wait a bit. All right, George says as he takes the iced coffee and heads to the living room. He sits next to Sherry and gulps down his drink. I continue preparing dinner, but Sherry doesn't offer to help. Not that I expected her to. In fact, I'd rather she didn't, she might mess something up. Eventually, dinner is ready, and we all eat. It's a simple spaghetti meal, but no complaints from George or Sherry, so it's all good. After dinner, the room has that relaxed post-meal atmosphere. Frank and the young couple are watching TV. No conversation, but that's better than the alternative. I leave the living room to get their change of clothes. On my way, I run into Frank, who's just come out of the shower. Should I offer George the shower first? I can go last. Oh, you've been out shopping, I can't make you wait. I enter the living room, laughing, to find George dozing off. George, don't sleep here. Go take a shower. Stop nagging. George replies listlessly. I place his change of clothes on him and hand Sherry hers. Sherry takes the clothes, but quickly pushes them back with a frown. I liked the ones I wore before. They weren't this flimsy. I'm taken aback by Sherry's complaint, but arguing would only escalate things. Oh, is that so? Wait a moment. As I go to look for the other clothes, George, uninterested in the whole affair, yawns and heads to the shower. While searching, Frank pops his head in. Do you know where my golf balls are? Aren't they next to the closet where you usually hang your coat and bag? I can't find them. Puzzled, I watch Frank leave and then go to Sherry with new clothes.
Ah, this is it. You get what you pay for.
Yes, these are clothes I bought when Sherry and I went shopping, specifically for when they stay over. Sherry had insisted on something expensive, and I had given in.
I'll shower next. I don't want to go after an old person.
Just as I'm about to retort, Frank returns, looking concerned. Still can't find them? Yeah. Sherry, do you know where the bag of golf balls next to the coat closet is? Frank, seemingly at a loss after searching everywhere, decided to ask around, not expecting much of an answer. What he got was a shock.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you accusing me of stealing? That's terrible. How could you suspect me?
Sherry's loud denial left me stunned. Frank tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but an irate Sherry wouldn't hear it. George, freshly showered, returned and we all tried to calm her down, but she stormed off to the shower room, still in a bad mood. The living room fell silent, filled with tension. "What just happened?" George asked Frank, noting that it's rare for Sherry to be this flustered. But why did she really get so angry? I couldn't help but suspect Sherry based on her usual behavior.
Come on, Dad, apologize. You're practically accusing her.
Before I knew it, George and Frank were arguing. It took me quite a while to break it up. Just then, Sherry returned from her shower, making things even more complicated. Now Frank was the one being grilled by the young couple. But Frank didn't back down. Especially when he scolded Sherry for her behavior today, she stormed off to the guest room. George continued to yell, blocking Frank, who tried to follow her.
You keep blaming Sherry, but you haven't apologized for suspecting her. You never apologize, that's what I hate about you.
Fed up, Frank muttered, "Do as you please," and retreated to his room. The living room fell silent again. I sighed and headed for the shower. "I'm going to bed," George said curtly, heading for the guest room. I stopped him. "The guest futon smells musty, George. Sleep in my room." Sherry when Frank and George went shopping, and Sherry overreacting to Frank's words. It just seemed suspicious to me, so I started to think that she was planning something by saying she had cleaned my room. So, I decided to let George use my room, which was supposed to be for Sherry. "Your room? I'm fine with a little mustiness. I'm not a kid anymore. What if you get pneumonia?" "See, that's what I mean." "Fine, I get it." George seemed annoyed but gave in and headed to my room. I glanced at the guest room Sherry was using. She wouldn't know about this exchange, being in a bad mood. If nothing's wrong, that's fine. I plan to prepare the guest room for George tomorrow. George opened the door to my room and went in.
Whoa, what the?
I heard George scream and rushed to my room, flinging open the half-closed door. I turned on the light and was speechless. George was in the room, clutching his leg in pain, surrounded by a scattering of golf balls. The golf balls Frank had been looking for were strewn all over my room. In a pitch-black room, George must have stepped on it. Of course he did. Who would ever think there'd be golf balls scattered all over the room? George lost his balance stepping on one, tried to regain it, but ended up putting his weight in the wrong place and fell. It seemed like he hit the floor hard with his entire body. He's clutching his leg and whimpering, tears streaming down his face. Hearing the commotion, both Frank and Sherry came out of their rooms. Frank peeked into the room from behind me and said,
"What's going on here?"
as he tried to help George up. But Frank also tripped on a golf ball and almost fell just like George. I turned around. There stood Sherry, pale as a ghost, trembling.
Why is this happening? This is Lyra's room."
Her voice was so soft it could have been drowned out by Frank's urgent questioning of George. "Yes, this is my room. Speaking of which, Sherry, you cleaned this room today, didn't you?" At my words, Frank and George turned around, and Sherry took a step back, flustered. "Did you see these golf balls when you cleaned?" I asked gently. Sherry just stood there, shaking. "Sherry? Do you know anything about these golf balls?" Still, Sherry remained silent.
Hey, Sherry. What's going on? Answer me.
George, losing his patience, raised his voice. But he's clearly in pain from the fall.
I didn't know. I didn't know you'd be coming into this room.
Reluctantly, Sherry backed away, shaking her head. Frank muttered, "We have no choice but to call an ambulance and the police." At those words, Sherry collapsed on the spot, sobbing. I immediately called an ambulance and the police and checked on George. He was sitting, clutching his leg, struggling to breathe, his face red with anger. He answered my questions, but his eyes were filled with anger towards Sherry. Eventually, the ambulance arrived, and I accompanied George to the hospital. After an examination, it was determined that George had fractured the top of his foot and would need to be hospitalized. By the time we got to the hospital, his foot was swollen and bruised, almost too painful to look at. The nurses and doctors advised reporting the incident to the police, clearly displeased with the situation. I said I would and stepped out to call Frank. Frank answered and told me the police had arrived and were currently taking statements. Then the call was handed over to a police officer, who said they would like to hear the full story later, to which I agreed. According to Frank, Sherry was just sitting on the floor, unresponsive to anyone or anything. After hanging up, I returned to George's hospital room, received instructions for his hospital stay, and decided to go home to gather some essentials. When I got back home, there was a crowd gathered around, making it difficult to get in. Finally making it inside the house, Sherry immediately started to lash out.
Why wasn't it you? Why did George go into that room? If you had gone in, none of this would have happened to George.
Breaking free from the police officer's restraint, Sherry lunged at me.
It should have been you. You're already old. If you had fallen, this house and this land would have been mine soon.
Sherry, spewing hateful words with a ferocity that felt like she could bite me, was pulled away by Frank and the police. Still, she continued to hurl insults at me, struggling to break free and lunge at me again. And then, Sherry was finally arrested. Suddenly silent as if a switch had been flipped, she was escorted out of the house by the police. She was put into a police car and taken away, drawing the attention of many onlookers. Left behind, Frank and I stood there, stunned, watching the whole sequence of events unfold. Snapped back to reality by the police officer, I briefly answered their questions and then headed back to the hospital with the essentials George needed. When I got to the hospital room, no nurses or doctors were around. After hearing about the situation at home, George, who had forgotten about his severe injuries, started making a commotion. A nurse rushed in, and we managed to calm him down.
I've been suspicious of her for a while. The way she sometimes looks at Mom bothers me. I've been meaning to say something.
Despite what he said, I'd never sensed any such thing from George, nor did it seem like he'd noticed. Rather, he always seemed to avoid getting involved in troublesome matters. George has always been the type to say whatever sounds good to get through the moment. This time was probably no different. I was utterly exasperated. Hey, Mom. I've been thinking for a while now. George, who had been ranting just moments ago, suddenly lowered his voice. Curious, I asked what it was. I'm thinking of breaking up with Sherry. I was surprised, but considering everything, it wasn't unreasonable. I don't know how Sherry acts when it's just her and George, but her behavior during visits has been terrible. She acts as if she's entitled to special treatment, refuses to help out, and throws tantrums if things don't go her way. We've never liked her, but we never thought about forcing George to divorce her. We've never been fans of her behavior, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean we ever thought about pushing George to divorce her. We never asked George what he thought about Sherry, and it felt wrong to even consider it. After all, George is an adult, and it's not our place to meddle in his marriage. Frank and I have even talked about staying out of it if George doesn't say anything. But now, George is coming to us for advice on divorce. I was at a loss for words. Mom, she's always so harsh with you, and she's been rude to Dad too. I can't take it anymore. That's when I felt something was off. Sure, Sherry has never held back her disdain for me. She doesn't even try to hide it, and I assume she acts the same way when it's just her and George. But she's indifferent to Frank. Frank is a gentle soul, but he's not much of a talker and has a stern face. That's probably why I've rarely seen them talk since they got married. So, it felt odd when she got flustered after Frank asked about the golf ball incident. She usually just gives cold replies, but this time she raised her voice. She must have felt exposed by Frank. Do I have to pay alimony if we divorce? And there are hospital bills too. Can you help, Mom? That's when it clicked. George has been trying to butter me up for this very reason. It's heartbreaking, but George is my flesh and blood. I can read his expressions and gestures. I know what he's thinking. I've always found him adorable and couldn't help but meddle, but ever since he hit puberty, he's found it annoying. Like Sherry, George also resents us, but he's playing the good son for the sake of money. Hey, George. What happened to the money for the car you said you were going to replace? The other day, when our son and his wife were visiting, my son pulled me aside when Sherry and Frank weren't around. Said he was thinking about getting a new car and needed some financial help because it was a bit pricey. Obviously, if he mentioned this in front of Frank, he'd be met with opposition, so he discreetly came to me. I couldn't say no to my dear George, so I gave him the full amount. But the car he drove home in was the same one he had before.
So, you haven't bought it yet?
If that's the case, you can use that money for the hospital bills. It might not cover alimony, but it'll help.
But then what about the car?
You can save up again once you're better. We have our own lives, you know. You're old enough to figure things out yourself. I'm pissed off. I was dumbfounded that George still expected financial help from us at this point. I left the hospital after saying just that. The truth is, I knew George had been squandering the money I gave him. Sherry had told me, though she was obviously benefiting from it too. I've always worried about him and meddled in his affairs, but it seems that has backfired. I took this as a good opportunity to tell Frank everything. After hearing me out, Frank said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about this. He recently lost his job and is in considerable debt." I was shocked, and so was Frank, who had heard this while they were out shopping. At this point, there's nothing more to say to George. Frank and I decided to disown him. Some time has passed since then. Sherry is now in prison after being convicted in court. And it seems she divorced George before the trial began. But I later heard that it was Sherry who initiated the divorce. Apparently, they were both initially enjoying the money they'd gotten from me, but George started reducing Sherry's share until he stopped giving her any at all. That's why she did what she did in my room, thinking it would bring money her way. It's a terrifying thought. As for George, he seemed to cling to the idea of divorce once Sherry suggested it, and ultimately agreed. He's not burdened much by alimony, but he's drowning in the debt he created. Of course, the money for the car had long been gambled away. We covered his hospital bills, but he's working hard to pay off his other debts. It's a pathetic situation, but it's the result of his lifelong dependency. I hope he learns from this. As for Frank and me, the money we'd been giving George actually came from Frank. I didn't have that kind of money, but Frank loved George and wanted it to come from me. Now that's no longer an option. We're planning a hot spring trip we've never taken before. I do regret putting George through all this, but considering everything, it can't be helped. Now, the happiest moments are when Frank and I are looking at travel magazines. By the time we had been married for 10 years, my mother-in-law, Mary, who holds biased values, committed an utterly foolish act. Sure, there's a significant age difference between Mary and I, so it's possible that something I said without thinking might have upset her. But Mary did the one thing she should never do. She acted in a way no educator should towards my daughter, Ellie, her granddaughter. At the time of the incident, I was so focused on caring for Ellie's mental well-being that I put my feelings aside, but now I'm writing this as a way to sort out my own thoughts as well. Mary's biased values likely came from her ex-husband, Mike. I heard he cheated on her with another woman right after my husband, John, was born, leading to their divorce. With the help of her parents and relatives, Mary managed to raise her 2 children, Jane, my sister-in-law, and John. I felt sympathy for her struggles up to the point and even admired her as a strong person. However, Mary became a misandrist because of Mike. It seems she had been deceived by men a few times before, and as a result, John grew up being neglected at home. Mary's family was wealthy, so Jane was sent to tutoring and extracurricular activities, but John was told, "It's a waste to spend money on you," and was allowed to do nothing. As a result, Jane graduated from a prestigious private university, entered a major corporation, got married, and even after having children, she worked full-time. Mary was proud of Jane and would only talk about her achievements at family meetings. On the other hand, John graduated from an obscure, low-ranked university and became a salesperson at a small to medium-sized company. Despite growing up in such an unfavorable environment, John has high social skills and a cheerful personality. He's doing well at his company, earning a higher salary through incentives. I know this because I worked in sales administration at the same place as John before we got married. I respect John, yet when we went to a family meeting, Mary looked down on him and said, "He's such a sloppy child. He's inferior compared to Jane." I snapped in that moment and retorted,
"I don't think so at all."
I still remember Mary glaring at me with a stern look, even 10 years later. Right then, I knew Mary had taken a dislike to me. The first thing she asked me was, "Which university did you graduate from? And where do you work now?" I had heard about mother-in-law getting angry about their daughter-in-law working, thinking I'd be told to focus on household duties. But that wasn't the case. I planned to support John by taking care of the household and working a part-time job so he could earn through sales. When I explained this to Mary and told her about my university and workplace, she said, "I've never heard of such a university. In this day and age, women should work too. I had a teaching qualification, so I managed to raise my children until they were adults. You should be grateful that you can work and do so as an employee. Don't depend on men for everything." I was dumbfounded.
John is working hard, so I want to do my best at home to make our house a more comfortable place. I think I can support us financially with a part-time job as well."
When I countered her argument, Mary became red with anger and lashed out.
"How is that going to work? Women like you are hindering the advancement of women in society. You should be ashamed."
She lectured me. After that, Mary introduced me to a relative's company, where I ended up working as a full-time employee. What Mary always used to say to me was, "Jane is smart and capable, but you and your husband are both hopeless." I thought it was normal for a mother-in-law would be happy when her son has a child. But maybe it wasn't novel anymore since Jane already had children. When I announced my pregnancy, "Even if you too have a child," Mary said with a sigh. I was infuriated, but realizing that Mary really doesn't care about John, I felt more sadness than anger. Though it seemed John had never had any expectations from Mary in the first place. "Well, for me, it's a precious child made with my beloved wife." "Don't say things like that," he said. I asked John regarding Mary's lack of joy over her grandchild, and he said, "Maybe once the baby is born, Mom's feelings will change. Jane is working, so she can't see Jane's kids much either." So, I decided to think of Mary as a tough love type. For example, when she said,
"You went to a low-level university just like David. Failing to study seriously when you're young leads to becoming a failure."
I would shift my thinking to,
"You could have gone to a better university if you had tried harder. What a waste of talent."
So, whatever Mary said didn't really affect me much. When Jane's child was born, Mary was overjoyed. She was present at the birth and visited Jane's house frequently. She spent $10,000 on baby gifts and necessities. When she bought a $5,000 stroller, I was amazed that such a world existed. However, when Ellie was born, Mary didn't come to the hospital to see Ellie, she said.
"Spending money on your daughter is a waste."
I felt uncomfortable and didn't ask for a baby shower gift. John seemed unhappy too and didn't mention it at all. Instead, Jane gave us a crib, baby items, and things I needed. I think Jane is a very good person. Feeling guilty because my gift wasn't as expensive, I said on the phone.
"I'm very grateful, but I can't accept all this. I haven't sent Jane nearly as much."
To which she replied,
"It's also to thank Mom for taking care of her. She hasn't been nice to you, right? Consider it compensation for that, so don't worry about it."
Jane is such a wonderful person. I wondered how she was raised by Mary. I felt saved by Jane's kindness. Maybe John grew up cheerful despite being disliked by Mary because of Jane's presence. Though we didn't receive a gift from Mary, the warmth from Jane's generosity made up for it. So, even if Mary doesn't dote on Ellie as a grandmother, we decided to love Ellie all the more. But once childcare began in earnest, I found myself busy with parenting at home every day. Mary then turned to me and John, saying,
"People like you shouldn't have children. Without that child, you could have been earning more and might have even had a higher position in your company."
Even John couldn't let that pass and retorted,
"Of course, children come first. I think having a lot of money means nothing if you're spiritually poor. We are working hard every day for Ellie. Take back what you said."
After that, Mary fell silent and stopped meddling in our ways. Even as Ellie grew up and started talking, Mary stubbornly refused to show her any affection. If we gathered at the in-laws for Christmas, Mary blatantly favored Jane's child, David, sitting him on her lap and ignoring Ellie even if she approached, showing a smile but not the same affection. Despite not really caring, in front of Jane, she pretended to show interest in Ellie. Jane, loving children, would likely be upset if she saw Mary being cold to Ellie. By the way, Mary never even smiled at Ellie. But Ellie was confused to see cold Mary becoming kind when Jane's family visited. Mary thinks men are betrayers, valuing Jane while unable to like John. Yet, she adores Jane's child. Believing a child raised by Jane couldn't grow up to betray women, whereas our child, Ellie, is irrelevant to her. Mary believes Ellie won't get into a good university because John and I graduated from low-tier colleges. So, when David started elementary school, she gave him a $20,000 entrance gift. I half expected nothing for Ellie's entrance gift, but surprisingly, Mary gave her a backpack. And said,
"If she's going to the school where I'm the principal, she needs to use something decent, or it'll embarrass me. Don't let her look poor, okay? I'd be the one ashamed."
That's what it seems. Indeed, the backpack Mary gave appeared to be from a renowned brand, but Ellie had her eye on another backpack. Seeing it at a shopping mall we frequently visit, she happily said,
"I want to go to school with that backpack."
So, I suggested buying that backpack for Ellie, but she said,
"Grandma bought this one for me, so it would be sad not to use it."
And so, I decided to respect Ellie's wishes. While I'm not ungrateful to Mary, I wish she had consulted us before purchasing. One day after school started, Ellie came home acting strangely. Just sitting on the sofa, staring at the TV instead of talking about her day as usual.
What's wrong, Ellie? You seem down. Did something happen at school?
Her reply was shocking. I couldn't eat lunch today.
Are you sick? Do you have a fever?
Checking her forehead, I found no sign of fever. No, the teacher said there was no lunch prepared for me today.
Was there an issue with the lunch? I didn't receive any notices.
No, everyone else had theirs. But there was none for me.
Huh?
I was stunned by Ellie's words. Her lunch was the only one not prepared? What could that mean?
Ellie, did something happen at school today?
No, not really. I got along with my friends, and I even got good marks on the test I got back. Saying this, Ellie pulled out a test paper with a perfect score from her backpack.
That's great. You worked hard on the test. You must be hungry since you didn't have lunch, right? How about we celebrate your perfect score with some delivery pizza today? Really? Yay!
Needless to say, seeing Ellie's smile return lifted my spirits a bit. But the problem wasn't solved. I messaged John.
I have something I need to discuss about Ellie, so please come home early today.
When we put Ellie to bed, John came home. I shared with John what I had heard from Ellie. It's possible that Ellie caused some trouble and her teacher got angry, but not serving her lunch was not right. That was our perspective as a couple. The next day was the weekend, so we left Ellie at my parents' and headed to the in-laws together.
Mom, Ellie came home yesterday without having lunch. Did something happen at school?
There's a huge problem. As expected, children of parents who graduated from low-tier universities just aren't good. Ellie is a liar. She cheated.
What?
Cheated?
What do you mean?
That's what the teacher reported. Ellie cheated on a test. According to Mary, the test Ellie scored perfectly on was supposedly not one a first grader could ace, and Ellie was suspected of cheating. The teacher asked Ellie to be honest, but Ellie insisted she had figured it out herself.
Where's the problem in that? Is there even proof she cheated?
All the other students couldn't even score 50 on it. Only Ellie getting 100 points clearly points to cheating. Liars need to be punished. So, I punished her. I had reached my breaking point. The hostility Mary had shown me up until now. I could twist any words directed at me, but malicious actions toward Ellie were unforgivable. John, usually mild-mannered, felt the same. As I was about to retort, the living room door opened. There stood Jane, looking furious.
Jane, why are you here?
Mary asked, her voice trembling.
I heard about Ellie and couldn't stay put. I rushed over after hearing you were coming to talk to Mom, and I could hear everything from outside the door, all the disrespectful things you were saying.
Jane's face was an expression of anger, turning Mary's face pale. Then John, glaring at Mary, said,
She's the only mother I have, and I wanted to respect her, but I can't continue a relationship with a parent who treats Ellie this way. I'm sorry, but I'm cutting ties with Mom.
After which Jane added,
I'm disappointed in Mom. I was grateful for how well she treated David, thinking she cared for Ellie the same. Enough with the favoritism. Until Mom reflects, David won't be seeing you,
she said defiantly. I also told Mary.
I could have resigned myself to being disliked as an outsider, but I've always hated how cold you were to John, and it broke my heart to see you being cold to Ellie. I've decided, for Ellie's sake, we won't see you again.
At that, Mary began to panic. I was wrong. I'm sorry. From now on, I'll treat Ellie kindly too," she said, tears in her eyes as she clung to me. Then John stood up for me.
"Enough of that. No offense to Mom, but we'll have to discuss this with the education board." Wait. If you do that, I'll..." Mom punished Ellie without any evidence. "It's only natural for us as parents to file a complaint, right? This can't be. Jane, please say something."
"Mom, if the same thing happened to David, I'd do the same as John. It's the natural action of a parent who has children." Afterwards, John reported the incident to the education board, and Mary resigned from her position as principal. The teacher who falsely accused Ellie was reprimanded and stepped down from being the class teacher. The reason Ellie scored perfectly on the test was revealed by David.
"That test is given to first graders every year. So, I taught Ellie how to solve the problems,"
he said proudly. Never underestimate a grade schooler. Ellie has made good friends and goes to school happily every day, and John and I feel much more at peace having cut ties with Mary. Speaking of which, we replaced Ellie's backpack. John said, "There's a kid who really wants Ellie's backpack. Can we give it to them? In exchange, we'll buy the one Ellie has been wanting." Guiding Ellie cleverly. Her face didn't seem to mind at all, so I was thankful for John's fib. A few months ago, we started living with my MIL, Karen. Even when we lived nearby, she used to harass me, but things escalated after we started living together. Karen's harassment came in two patterns. The first was about my hobby of toll painting. When I displayed my finished pieces at home, she would say, "What's this? This creepy ornament. Where did you get it as a souvenir?" Then hide it in the closet, replacing it with her own paintings, which were far creepier. Next, she found my toll painting kit in my room. "I thought these were some creepy pieces of wood you picked up from the park or somewhere, so I threw them away," she said. Would anyone think neatly cut pieces of wood in the shape of flowers were found in a park? And she probably threw away my paints as well. But I couldn't say anything about it. The second pattern was about meals. When we started living together. "And, do you have any foods you dislike?" Karen asked me. Without much thought, I honestly answered, "I'm not fond of fried food." Then, despite saying, "You might not like it, but..." she would serve fried food 3 times a week. However, honestly, the second issue doesn't bother me much. Indeed, I'm not a fan of fried food, but in truth, Karen is an excellent cook. The meals she prepared were all incredibly delicious. My parents were not only extremely poor, but also terrible cooks. Unfortunately, it seems children do inherit their parents' traits, and I, too, am awful at cooking. There was a time I aimed to overcome this weakness, but seeing no signs of improvement, I decided to give up. On the other hand, Karen could easily be mistaken for a professional chef, and if her boastful tales are to be believed, she once ran a cooking class. I had to stop because I couldn't find students who could keep up with my level, she claimed, though I suspect she may have harassed her students. Anyway, the fact remains that Karen's cooking is excellent. I said I disliked fried foods, but that was based solely on what I had at home. About 80% of the fried foods served for dinner was frozen, and the remaining 20% were discounted deli items from the supermarket. The cold deli was particularly unpleasant. Raised on such fare, it's no surprise I can't make decent fried food. My one attempt at fried chicken ended up burnt on the outside and raw on the inside, nearly causing stomach upset, so I vowed never to fry anything again. But Karen's is different. Her fried chicken, especially, is a masterpiece, crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside, with perfect seasoning. I could eat it endlessly. Karen excels at any fried dish, all of them of professional quality. As much as I repeat it, Karen intended it as harassment, so there seemed no point in correcting her. Each time fried food was served, I would rub my stomach, stand up, and sometimes cover my mouth as if I was going to be sick. Seeing this, Karen would ask, "What's wrong? Are you feeling ill?" Her words were concerned, but her face was clearly pleased. Interestingly, Karen never serves fried food when her husband, Michael, is present.
It's not good for the health. It would be terrible if Michael's health were compromised, right?
And me? That goes without saying. I've always been too thin, often told I should gain some weight, so eating Karen's fried food was hardly a problem for me. As for Michael, having grown up eating Karen's delicious meals, he's quite overweight. So, Karen's precautions seem entirely reasonable. After a year of pretending to dislike the fried food, disaster struck. Karen accidentally spilled coffee on a toll painting I had spent 6 months completing, ruining it.
I'm so sorry. I think I saw something similar on a flea market app, so I'll buy it for you later,
she said, and I finally lost my temper. That night, with Michael and my FAL Bob working late, dinner was just Karen and me. As expected, she served fried food, and I finally told her off.
Karen, you may have been trying to harass me by serving fried food, which I said I disliked, but it was all incredibly delicious to me. Thank you so much for making the effort to annoy me,
Karen responded.
For 45 years since I got married, I've been cooking non-stop, but neither Bob nor Michael ever said my food was delicious. Now, hearing it from and I realize what I've always wanted was just a simple delicious. Thank you, thank you.
Hearing that made me think. Come to think of it, Michael always seems to eat my cooking with a look of displeasure. Have I ever heard a word of praise from Michael? No, never. Well, I suppose there's some semblance of affection for Michael, so I've tried my best to cook despite my lack of skill. However, Michael always seems to eat as if he dislikes the food. Sometimes, he even has an expression that says he doesn't want to eat anymore. Come to think of it, is it delicious? Have I ever asked him? I believe he said,
"It's not bad, right?"
I'm the one asking. If it's bad, just say it's bad. As I was mulling over these thoughts, years of pent-up frustrations began to pour out of Karen. And they kept coming.
Bob has never taken the initiative to do any household chores. Michael has never helped out on his own since he was little. They'll do it if asked, but both are so bad at it, it's easier if I just do it myself. When they come home, jackets are left wherever they're removed. They don't know the first thing about tidying up. I'm not a housekeeper.
As I listened, I started to get really annoyed. Really annoyed. Indeed, Michael seems to have inherited Bob's traits. Even now, at his age, he leaves his jacket wherever. He doesn't tidy up at all. It's been 2 years since we got married, and I'm already fed up. Karen endured this for 45 years. No wonder she'd resort to petty revenge to vent her frustrations.
Michael, Bob, how come you never say thank you or that the meal is delicious after someone makes you dinner? Cooking is a wife's job. Why should I have to say thanks?
Right, Michael? Yeah. Besides, even if we don't say it, we think it's delicious, so it's fine. My anger exploded at their complaints.
Cooking is a wife's job? Nowadays, it's normal for spouses to share household duties. Even if the wife takes the lead because she's a stay-at-home wife, you should still say thank you. Michael. I think so, so it's understood? What's that about? Michael, When you come home, if I don't say welcome back, you get grumpy, right? How is that any different?
Usually playing the role of a modest wife, my sudden intensity shocked both Michael and Bob. But they still seemed unconvinced, tilting their heads in confusion.
I'm
asking you to speak properly, aren't I? Fed up to the point of refusing to speak further.
Enough is enough. Until you change your attitudes, I'm going to stop cooking. Karen, you don't have to cook either,
I said. True to my word, I boycotted cooking from that day on. For dinner, I'd just put instant ramen on the table before locking myself in my room when Michael got home from work. Watching from afar, Michael was just eating the ramen as is. When I asked if it was delicious, "It's not bad, right?" That's enough for me. But then, a miracle happened. Worried about Karen, I visited the in-laws one Sunday, and surprisingly, Michael and Bob came forward to apologize for everything. Shocked by the sudden apology, I asked them what was going on. Michael, utterly unable to grasp why I was angry, apparently mentioned it to a colleague after getting tired of instant ramen.
My wife stopped cooking dinner. Isn't it normal for the wife to take care of meals?
Overheard by female employees.
Normal for the wife? What era are you living in?
So old-fashioned.
Outdated. The worst. Don't you help out at home? Poor Anne.
The women ganged up on him, and he was quite taken aback. I'm truly grateful to those female colleagues. Bob made a similar mistake, seeking agreement from his chess buddy Henry.
Cooking is a wife's job, right? No need to say thanks for that, right? Anne's making a big deal out of nothing, right?
Overheard by Henry's DIL. She was furious. Her reaction was much the same as the female employees, but with even more intensity. Even Henry chimed in.
Bob, times have changed. Nowadays, both men and women do household chores. I do the laundry and cleaning every day.
And he was gently admonished by him. Finally realizing their mistakes, they came to apologize. But when I asked,
"What will you do from now on?"
their response was vague. So, we agreed they would help with chores, say when meals are delicious, and clearly express any dislikes. I made Michael and Bob sign a contract to settle the matter for now. Finally, Bob said to Karen,
"I've been wrong all this time. Your cooking is truly delicious. Please keep it up."
Karen replied,
"It feels like my efforts over the years are finally being recognized,"
and started crying again. When Michael just stared, I glared at him until he said,
"Thank you, Anne."
I decided to take that as a win. Since then, words of thanks and compliments on the food have started to slip out of Michael's mouth. Karen mentioned Bob was doing the same. It turns out Karen's harassment stemmed from her own frustrations with her life with Bob. Once Bob changed his ways, the harassment stopped.
"I'm sorry for using you as an outlet for my stress. Would you teach me toll painting?"
She even asked. There's no reason to refuse, and gaining a hobby partner is a joy for me. Karen, naturally skilled, is making rapid progress. Lately, I've also started learning to cook from Karen. Teaching her daughter to cook was Karen's dream. My cooking skills are improving, and it feels great to be able to give back.